graphically or numerically show the specific things like growth in population, growth in prison populations, that sort of thing?
Yeah, actually, the state has a pretty good website that shows some of those things.
Okay.
And so if you go to OFM for Office of Financial Management, so ofm.wa.gov, they have a lot of really good information on the website. And one of those is that they have a little tab. They have a couple little tabs that describe the state budget, that describe what's happening in the state economy, that describe the state population. But they have a budget driver. Well, they do have this budget driver thing in there. And it talks about these exact things. You know, what is the growth of K-12 population? What is the growth of higher education cohort? What's the growth of expected prison? Those exact. What's the growth of the elderly population?
Yeah.
So they have. It's not a complete thing, but it's a really good kind of baseline. These are the things that are pushing increases in the budget. Obviously, medical inflation being so much faster than in regular inflation has been one of the things that's been driving increases in the state budget. And you know, I think you're probably all aware that one of the things that drives public school budgets to increase faster than inflation and population growth, even, you know, part of it's the healthcare costs, but it's also the growth in special education populations, which are much more costly to instruct, that need a lot more individualized attention. The bilingual population that many of our districts have, and in increasing numbers of our districts are really grappling with bilingual populations. So that there are a lot of, that's not all necessarily described in that OFM website.
But what I'm thinking is that in order to counter these assertions, we need some easily accessible and very simple ways to present the complex assertion that we're making.
Right. Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah. And I don't have, I unfortunately don't have that in this presentation. But if I come back next year, maybe I'll try to put that in. I try to get it on the stick. Anyway, so we probably have to whip right along here since we started late. So that's kind of the immediate problem of the recession, and who knows, you know, hopefully it will start turning the corner there, as long as gas prices don't suck all the air out of it. But we have a longer-term problem too, as you know, we've seen. There's a longer-term problem, and the longer-term problem is really rooted in our we have a kind of messed up state tax structure. Our state basic tax structure was adopted in 1935. And the economy of our state was very, very different in 1935. It wasn't really a perfect system even then, but it was much more suited to the economy of 1935 than it is to the economy of 2011. So some of the major glaring problems with our state tax system is that it's highly regressive, which means that lower income people pay a much higher percentage of their income in state and local taxes than high income people do. Our tax revenues grow much more slowly than the state economy does. So the revenues don't just naturally keep pace with growth. And then we also just keep cutting taxes and giving special tax breaks, which makes the problem worse. So here's a picture of the state revenue stream that goes into that general fund. And remember, about 44% of the state general fund goes to support K-12 education. So over 50% of our general fund revenues come from the sales tax. That's really unusual for any state to have over half of our general funds come from the sales tax. And then there's more from selective sales tax, so that's like the tobacco and liquor and other kinds of taxes like that. We have a business and occupation tax, which I won't go into in detail, but if any of you are small business owners, you know all about it.
What do you mean by, I'm sorry, what do you mean by unusual that it's the sales tax is 50%? I mean, I know that other states have income taxes, but in addition
yeah, and
to
I have a slide that shows how other states tend to get their revenues from. We get about 12% from property taxes, and then there's kind of a hodgepodge of other taxes. We have a state tax, we have real estate tax, and kind of a hodgepodge of other taxes that bring in the rest of our state revenues. So here is kind of a picture of the regressivity of Washington's system. The blue bar here is Washington's tax system. The red bar is the U.S. average for all of the states together. And this shows the percent of people's income that they pay in state and local taxes by income level. So we start over here with the poorest 20% of the population, paying in Washington close to 17% of their taxes, either directly or indirectly. So the assumption here is, for example, if you're paying rent, your landlord, who wants to, at least break even, if not make a profit, is going to charge into your rent the cost of the property tax and whatnot. So there's some assumptions that not just exactly what you're paying directly in taxes here. Compared to the U.S. average, most U.S. states have a kind of regressive system, but not nearly as regressive as Washington. In the U.S. average, it's more like 12%. This is the next 20%. Here's the middle. By the fourth 20%, Washington is pretty close to where the U.S. average is. And then these last three are the top 20% income group that are broken into 15%, 4%, and then the very top 1% of incomes. And as you can see, the top 20%, and the wealthier you are, the less you're paying relative to your peers in other states.
How many states typically have income tax?
How many states do?
Yes.
There's 7 that don't. We're one of 7.
Okay. Well, so then you're figuring that the poorest, they're paying that in their food and their things that they're purchasing in the stores.
Not necessarily food.
50% of it is coming out. I mean, it's not an income tax.
Washington only, the top 20% paid 95% of federal income tax. And if you go do your taxes, which you probably did last week, how much income tax did you pay versus how much sales tax did you write off?
Right.
It's an enormous amount.
Right.
So actually the bar goes the other way if you talk about federal income tax.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
So we tried to rectify that with an initiative and everyone said no thank you.
Yeah.
big time, because California is a lot better off than we are.
So that's a picture of the regressivity that I talked about. And you may think it's just fine that it's that regressive, but that's part of the issue, is that, in fact, when we go talk to people about state taxes, the majority of people in Washington state are paying more than their peers in other states, while the very wealthiest among us are paying less than their peers in other states are. This is an attempt to show that our tax revenue stream doesn't grow at the same pace as the economy of the state does. So this first bar here shows the increase in sales tax revenue in Washington state between 2000 and 2009. And this bar here shows the increase in state personal income over the same period of time. And as you can see, state personal income increased a whole lot faster than sales tax revenue. And remember, that's over half of our state general fund revenue. So the economy grows, population grows, the pressures on schools grow, demand for higher quality education grows, but we don't have the revenue base that really keeps up with that. And then, in addition, we give a lot of tax breaks all the time, and any one of those may have a lot of justification to it. And the legislature doesn't just do it really willy-nilly. They have hearings and they listen to it, and but the problem is that each one is considered really on its own. When we adopt the budget, it's okay, we have this much money to spend, period. And no matter how much we've proven that investing in early learning pays off in those individual children's lives and in savings to the system later on down the road, oh well, we don't have enough money to fund that important program. No matter how much we know, we really need to have more rigorous math and science classes in our high schools and add another period in high school and make all of those other improvements that we all want to make in our system. We only have so much to spend. But the tax breaks don't really have that same kind of balancing, well, this is really more important than this. They're considered individually by themselves and not relative to a bottom line. And once they're passed, they're never reconsidered, basically. Sometimes they're sunsetted, but for the most part, they just remain in place once they're passed. So they're never balanced against the other needs and priorities of the state. So we lose about $4 billion a year in revenue at this point in special business tax breaks.
Here's an example.
Can I give an example? Yeah, so one of them is back in the 1970s when there were a lot of issues in the state in the 1970s. That was sort of the time of the big Boeing bust, and Washington Mutual was sort of a major player then. We enacted a special tax break for the earnings that banks made on home mortgage loans. Now, in those days, you went down to your local bank, you got a mortgage, your local bank kept your mortgage, and that was pretty much it. Now, of course, they're all sold and securitized and multinational, whatever, and of course, WAMU is long gone. But we still have that tax break on the books where there's no evidence that it necessarily benefits Washington homeowners in having lower interest rates than anybody else pays anywhere else around the country. And it's, these big multinational banks that don't really care about Washington other than, getting home mortgage loans and making a profit here. But we still have that on the books. It may have made sense in the 1970s when it was adopted to help a homegrown bank, do well. But does it make sense in today's context? That would be one that I would put out there. But there's quite a few others. And if you're interested in looking at them, the state also has a list of everything at dor.wa.gov. The Department of Revenue has a listing of all of them, if you want to see them. So this shows part of the sort of the structural deficit, and what this line is the percent of the state general fund of all state personal income, right? So how much of state personal income is going to the state general fund, and this didn't show up very well, but so back in the early 1990s, it was 6.7% of state personal income was going to the state general fund, and we've been bumping along right at 5.96% over the last decade. So during the 1990s, we had a period of decline, and if you recall, during the 1990s, if you were living here in Washington, there were several big tax-cutting initiatives during that period of time. And so somebody asked earlier about other states and where they're getting their revenue. So this shows Washington compared to the U.S. average in terms of sources of revenue that come to the state. So here you see, for the typical state, gets about a third of its revenue from general sales tax, whereas we're getting, this shows only 50%. I mean, anyway, but yes. So as you saw earlier, actually, if you did it for this year, it'd be a little over 52%. Selective sales taxes were about the same. Most states get quite a bit of revenue, about a third or more from an income tax. We actually collect more in business taxes than a lot of states that have a business income tax. This looks like our property taxes are higher, but this is only because more of our property tax goes to the state than in most states. In many states, all of property taxes stay in local government. In Washington, about 20% of property taxes go to the state as the state school levy. So our property taxes are actually right around average, just under average, if you look at the full state and local property tax bill that Washington people pay. And of course, we have the immediate problem of slow recovery from the recession, which is just continuing to depress particularly sales tax revenue, but all revenues. Last November's elections didn't go real well for people who wanted to see a little bit more revenue coming into the state. The public voted overwhelmingly yes on Initiative 1053, which was the Tim Lyman one, that requires that the legislature pass any new revenue increase, including ending tax breaks, by a 2/3 vote, which isn't happening in this legislature, or be voted on by the people. They voted last year. The legislature did raise some taxes, including a sales tax on soda pop and candy, adding those to the sales tax. Those got repealed. Of course, voters said no to 1098, the high income tax. But at the same time, a lot of local levies passed. Not every single local levy passed, but a lot of local school levies, parks levies, 911 levies, and the like did pass around the state. So people weren't saying no to everything. You know, if it was something real specific in their community, chances were the voters were going to say yes. But if it was something bigger and a little more amorphous, they said no pretty overwhelmingly. And of course, we're getting no new federal funds. So what can the legislature do in terms of revenues, other than just deal with what they have and try to cut as much as they can? By a simple majority, they can raise fees, and there is some fee raising going on. They can raise taxes or close tax breaks with a simple majority if they then send that to the voters for a referendum. They can cut spending, of course. They can increase scrutiny of tax breaks. Even though they can't end tax breaks, they could increase scrutiny of them. They can pass new tax breaks, and there have been quite a few proposed. They can also expand the number of items that are sold in state liquor stores, for example. In Michigan, they had party stores, and you could buy all sorts of other items besides liquor in the state stores. That's not going to happen either, believe me. But with a 2/3 majority, they could raise taxes or close tax breaks. But with this legislature, they're not going to get a
So
majority.
they can repeal the ones that don't make sense, but they have to have a majority? Is that what you're
Two-thirds.
They have to have a 2/3 majority, right? So there's been, you know, there have been a number proposed, but you know, even getting a majority in the committee has been tough at this point. So of course there have been cuts all the way down the line in not just in education, but in a lot of other things as well. The basic health plan, which is the state's health insurance program for lower income working people who aren't getting health insurance other ways, that's been cut back to the bone, though hasn't been eliminated. There have been huge cuts in home care services for seniors and disabled people, to the point that some people are no longer able to stay independent and are having to go into nursing homes or losing function and whatnot. There have been big cuts in mental health services as well. So there really are cuts all along the line. And of course, you know, state employees are on mandatory furlough days, so they're taking pay cuts. That's true in a lot of local governments as well. Anyway, there's just cuts to the cuts down the line. Well, is there any hope? I don't know. There is one bill in the legislature that's been proposed, and this would close that bank tax break, as well as right now tourists, people who come into Washington and buy things from states that have a sales tax of less than 3% don't have to pay any sales tax. If you live in Oregon or Alaska or some of the other states with either no or very, very low sales tax, you don't have to pay anything. So House Bill 2078 would end that bank tax break, and people from Oregon would have to pay sales tax, basically. It would raise about $160 million per biennium, and it would be devoted to K through third grade class size reduction. And it has a lot of support. Lori Jenkins of Tacoma area and 47 of her colleagues signed on to the bill. But, you know, will it get 2/3 majority? I'd be kind of surprised.
Well, it seems like part of the problem is combining too many things into one House bill. You know, a lot of people agree with one thing, but not the other, so nothing happens.
Right. But, you know, if you, and to, you know, to find one tax break that raises enough money to do something significant with becomes a real problem. Right.
Next question. Are we paying our state Senate legislators for this special session?
Yes. Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Why are they paying the salaries when they can't get their job done?
Well, their salary doesn't go up. I mean,
Well, I
they
know
don't,
that, but they're still being, I mean.
and actually most of them, most of them aren't there. I mean, they get a per diem while they're in Olympia, but they've been sent home. And they'll be called back when there's a budget deal.
So the answer is no, they're not getting money unless they're there.
So I mean, so my understanding is, you know, they're not, their salaries don't go up.
But there's
If
an
they were there in
operational
Olympia,
cost.
they'd be getting a per diem, but most of them aren't in Olympia. It's just the people that are working on trying to come up with a.
But there's an operational cost to extending.
There is an operational
the special
cost.
session.
Yes, there is. There is.
So it should come out.
There are a couple of other potential bills out there, and again, these are going to be tough to pass, but that could potentially raise some revenue, some of which could go for K-12. These are both in the Senate. One would send a referendum to the voters saying, hey, when you voted on 1053 last year, did you really mean that we can't close tax breaks as well as we can't raise other taxes? And see if, in fact, they can remove the 2/3 requirement for any tax breaks. So that's one of them.
And that's not likely to go through?
I don't know. We'll see. I mean, it could. I mean, a lot of it depends on what they're hearing from their constituents. You know, and they've actually started, I think the fact that they were starting to hear from constituents has emboldened them to start proposing these kinds of things as late in the day as it is. These didn't get introduced at the beginning of the session when people were saying, oh, the voters have spoken, we can't do anything. I think they started hearing enough that it emboldened them to at least propose some things to talk about. And then another bill in the Senate would give all preferential business and occupation tax breaks a 25% reduction. I mean, basically lower them instead of eliminating them. But, you know, whether or not they're going to be able to get something through, I think is a problem, you know, who knows. And likely anything that does pass is going to have to go to the voters. And anything complicated that goes to the voters, it's hard to explain things to people in a 30-second soundbite in a way that really makes sense. So even if they're able to get it through the legislature, whether it would stand up to a vote of the people is another question entirely. So I think, you know, we really need to think about the long term. You know, we're in an immediate crisis right now. There's not a lot we can do other than we can continue to let our legislators know and the governor know that we really do care about funding K-12 education adequately and following through on the kinds of reforms and promises for good policy that have been made. But we also have to think longer term, and we have to really engage in a conversation, in my opinion, as citizens of the state of Washington about how adequately we really do want to fund education. We can't just say, we've got to do it. We have to come up with a way. And that means educating ourselves about what the state tax structure is, what are other possibilities, and talking with our friends and neighbors about it in a way that we really do get a conversation going to the point where we can make some structural changes in our state tax structure. From my perspective, and I think from those of a lot of people, whether or not they would agree on the specifics, I think a lot of people from different political persuasions would agree on some of these basic principles. We need to reduce the structural deficit. We need to have a way where revenues, public revenues, grow naturally as our economy grows. So we don't have to raise rates all the time because the revenues increase at the same pace that the general economy does. We want to reduce the regressivity of it. You know, most people don't think it's all that fair that lower income people are paying a higher percentage in state and local taxes than the highest income among us, and it basically leaves a lot of money on the table that other states are able to collect and devote to public purposes. To do that, really, the only way to do both this and this is we need to find a way to raise taxes on higher income people and then lower the most progressive of our taxes, which is the sales tax typically. There are a lot of inequities in the business taxes that I'm not going to go into today, but there are, believe me, and business people can tell you all about those. And then we need to raise sufficient revenue to fund what we agree collectively we do need to fund as a state. And I think most of us would say, many, not all of us would say, we're not really doing that now. So, you know, basically, the only thing that really grows at the same pace as the economy is incomes. And that's what most states have done. It's a tried and true thing. It doesn't guarantee you're never going to have problems again. And you know, every state practically has had problems with their state budgets during this recession because it's been a huge one that's hit everything really hard. But nevertheless, I think many people would agree that it's an important part of the equation if we really want to adequately fund the kind of education system that we want for our kids. You know, what would make sense? Do we go, you know, we did 1098, which was limited to high incomes. Do we do something like that again? Try it again, tweak it, but try basically the same thing again. Do we go smaller? 1098 started at incomes of 400,000 for a couple. Do we go to just the millionaire's tax, say, make it even smaller fraction, which means you're not going to raise nearly as much money?
It's not a constitutional problem.
Or do you go bigger? Well, one of the criticisms of 1098 was, well, after a couple of years, the legislature could extend it to everybody. You know, they need a lot more guts than they have, but, you know, they could. In theory, it could happen. So do we just start with a really full-scale reform? Something like the Gates Commission proposed nearly 10 years ago now, where we do a graduated general income tax, where we significantly reduce the sales tax, where we revise business taxes significantly, and a lot of the special tax rates, but also in the context of a, sort of starting from scratch business tax that makes sense for today's economy. Do we go to some kind of full reform? That's something that's complicated, would be hard to do in the context of an initiative, would be hard to do without real big buy-in from a lot of the citizenry of Washington State, which is something we're probably not going to get to in the next year or two. But we might get to it if we really start a concerted conversation. So, like I said at the beginning, I don't have any answers for you today. It really is a lot of questions, and it's really what are you willing to do? What are we willing to do as a state in terms of how far we're really willing to push the envelope in order to bring in the kinds of revenues we need for a good education system. But it really is going to take all of us if we want to change the dynamics of the conversation from the pretty narrow focus that it's been over the last few years to a much broader discussion about what we really need in the state. So, how much longer do we have?
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
So who's currently championing the full reform right now? Which senators or representatives?
There's really been, I don't think there's been a proposal in the legislature to do a full-scale reform this session. Most of the proposals that have been put forth by various people in the legislature have been for pretty small things. Ending one tax break or maybe a collection of tax breaks. There have been, I don't think there have been any proposals this year around doing a state income tax. When Rosa Franklin was in the Senate, every year she introduced something, but she retired last year and isn't in there now. So I don't think they've had one to do anything fuller, but there are conversations going on among a lot of people, and at this point, I don't know of anything that's really gelled. I think people are really kind of in exploratory mode right now about what people really have an appetite for and what seems like it could really gain some ground. So I think there are a lot of different conversations going on, and it's the kind of thing where all of you could actually have a hand in that conversation.
So the states that do a more traditional, and I've lived in 4 states that have a traditional sales tax this is the first state that I've been that doesn't have income tax.
Mm-hmm.
So how are their state budgets doing? Are they in deficit too? I mean, before we take a full reform to make a new system, which I think you can't just. I think like 1098 didn't pass, you're not going to be able to tax just one group of people. I think you're going to have to redo everything. But before you redo everything, is it working in the other states, or are they having issues too?
Let's see, we have two problems going on. We have 2 problems. One is the recession. And basically all public revenue falls in a recession. You cannot create a tax system. Property tax is relatively stable, but even that's going to go down. You cannot create a public revenue system that doesn't decline during a recession.
I understand that, but which states are doing okay? Which states are doing the best out of it? What's their tax system? I mean,
it's Nevada's kind of a basket case, actually. Some of the smaller rural states are really, it kind of depends on what their economy is doing. Some of the states are, every state has a little bit different mixture, and it really depends more on their economy. I think the bigger structural issue, though, if you remember back to some of those earlier slides about the our declining place relative to other states in terms of funding education, other states are, they're managing to keep things up better than we are.
Yes, they are paying more per student than we are.
Right.
No matter what our states look like as far as how much money we're paying in income tax or not, personal income tax, we are still paying less per student than other states are. And I come from 2 other states that are pretty high on the chart. And I was actually kind of shocked when I moved here at how poor your schools are. And one of the reasons that PTA is so huge here and not so huge in the other states is because you have to have PTA in order to fund these things, because the people here don't want to pay an income tax or whatever. I don't know what it is. So
Oregon is actually, their legislature is actually putting an initiative on the ballot next year telling the voters that if they don't voluntarily raise their income tax, they're going to cut 10 school days. So if you want to ask about a state that's very close to us has an income tax versus sales tax,
But that's not income tax, sales tax related. That's because they have a state health care plan that's in the hole. Their state deficit is not school related.
Quite frankly, I was hoping when we were going to come in here and have a discussion about how we get our legislators to actually fulfill their constitutional mandate to fund education adequately. We do not do that in the state, and it has nothing to do with taxes. If you want to talk about raising taxes and
Disagree.
tax structure to fund other things that are not constitutionally mandated, then we should have that discussion. But the fact is, the Constitution of this state requires the state to spend its money on education amply. We do not do that, and I think your point is exactly right. We don't spend enough money on our education system. That should be where our first dollars come from, and we should be having that discussion, not whether or not we should be bringing in income tax, which it doesn't matter.
And actually, Oregon also has a very unbalanced. So, thank you for your comment. So, Oregon's system is equally unbalanced with ours, I would say. I mean, an ideal system, and I think most economists and people across an ideological spectrum would agree, that you need a balanced revenue structure that takes revenue from a variety of sources. That way, when you do have recessions, different recessions are going to hit different parts of your economy differently. The collapse of the construction economy, part of the economy, has really impacted us here in Washington. When the stock market falls a lot, that really hits states that have a graduated income tax, because the wealthiest people are losing a whole lot of their income for a couple of years. So you need to have a balanced tax structure. The fact that Oregon has no sales tax is really as bad of a system as ours of having no income tax. I would say Idaho now is a state that has a pretty balanced tax system, and that might be a good model for us. They have, not real high rates on anything, but they have, they kind of cover the board in terms of a pretty decent kind of tax system. So that might be one model we want to take.
I would agree that it's important to talk about how our tax system fares during periods of recession. I remember you presenting several years ago here before the recession, and you were saying that we were in trouble even then. So I think a recession is one of the things we should discuss, but I think that's not our only problem. We've got a problem with funding even outside of recession.
Yeah, and that, because part of the issue, we will get out of this recession. It's going to take some misery, and it's not going to be this year, unfortunately. But we are going to get out of it. That's not going to solve the problem of adequacy for funding education. And just telling the legislature, you got to do it, isn't going to cut it. Does that mean we shut our state prisons? Does that mean we eliminate higher education? Does that mean we throw children who aren't being cared for adequately by their families? Just say, oh well, sorry. There are other things that we are also required to do as a state that the legislature can't really back away from. But there's always people there, fighting for their piece of the pie. And so part of it is, in fact, asking the legislature to do their part in terms of stepping up for the money. Yes?
I keep seeing this. Majority of the income tax stuff is coming from the lower income people, and we're not tapping the high income people. products that aren't even reasonable anymore. Why is all the emphasis on making us pay more instead of fixing these big holes that are draining some of what we're paying?
And there's been attempts to do that, but every individual tax break that was passed had a strong enough lobby pushing for it to be passed initially that they are also able to pretty easily muster a lobby to lobby against ending it. And there's a certain solidarity. Actually, if you look at who funded Initiative 1053, last year there was a serious attempt to end some of the tax breaks that I think there was some general agreement. If we're going to end some, these make sense to really look at. Every one of those business types, big oil, banks, business bank one was looked at, invested heavily in Initiative 1053 in order to make it nearly impossible that when the legislature came back this year, they'd be able to, again, take a serious look at ending those tax breaks. So, there's a lot of politics that goes on.
Well, if you went,
This gentleman has a spoken, so I'll go to him first and then to you.
I can only speak for me. And for me, when I look at the legislature, when I look at politicians, when I look at big businesses, the first two words that enter my mind is no trust. I do not trust them. And if that organization or if those entities are asking me for more money, my first response is, no, I'm not giving you any more. You already don't know how to balance what you have. Why in the world would I give you any additional funds? That includes income tax.
Wait, I have to interject something.
You're not allowed to think
I want
that.
to interject something. I'm a president of a PTA. I was elected to this position, and I'm in charge of a budget. It is the same difference. It's just that they have a bigger constituency. So if you don't trust them, vote them out. But don't blame every single politician because we're responsible for what they do.
Who's in there?
and when I went to Focus Day, I think that the most shocking thing that I saw was, okay, they're making cuts here, they're making cuts there, they're making cuts here. Somebody said, well, how do you balance the budget? Okay, so cut out environmental health, right? Because nobody needs that. We don't need a decent environment, right? And cut out human services because we don't need healthy children. Where does it stop? You can't, if you continue to cut and cut and cut, you have nothing.
Well, I think it's going to take that for people to actually restructure properly. It's going to take rock bottom.
Yeah, that's probably true. That's probably true.
For just a minute, it is time for the class to be over, so those of you who want to go ahead and leave to go on to your next class.
Thank you so much.